In this lecture, we will talk about the second way of creating layouts in CSS, which is CSS Grid. So, just like Flexbox, CSS Grid is also a set of related CSS properties that we can use to create a layout. Now, the big difference between Flexbox and CSS Grid is that CSS Grid is perfect for creating bigger and two-dimensional layouts. So basically, as the name says, for creating grids. Now, before we apply CSS Grid to our page here, I want to very quickly create a small demo here just to show you what CSS Grid is all about and how it works. So this code that I'm going to write now, there's no need for you to write as well. You can just watch, basically. So after this header, I will just create a div with the class of test. And then in there, I will create some paragraphs with the class of child. Let's just give it some number, and then I will just copy and paste it a few times. And let's do 5 children here. So that's what this looks like. And now let's style them. So test and child. Do it here at the very bottom so I can just easily delete it at the end. So again, you don't need to write this, but now you can see how I basically write CSS a bit faster. So let's give it a background color of black here. And each of the children will have a background color of, again, red. So that looks like this. Let's also give it some margin, let's say 100 pixels. So just so we have something to work with here. All right, let's change the font size here a little bit. Okay, there you go. And now it's time to apply CSS Grid. And just like Flexbox, we use the display property and set it to grid. So you see, nothing really changed. And that's because by default, these grid items are placed one after another as rows. So in CSS Grid, we have the concept of columns and rows. And so we can basically create some columns and some rows, and then our items will be placed inside of those cells, which is what they call it like. So nothing better than writing an example. So the property for columns is grid template columns. Okay, so let's say 50 pixels and then another value for the second column. So we can create different columns simply by specifying different values here. So let's say we want the first one to have 50 pixels and the second one 200 pixels. And there we go. So now we immediately have some columns, and then our items are automatically placed inside those columns and rows. And to see this a bit better, we can also, just like in Flexbox, add some gap here. So let's say 30 pixels. And in Grid, we can even specify a different column and row gaps. So let's do that. So let's say column gap 30, but row gap 50, for example. Okay, and of course, if we change this, then the column would get a little bit wider. And if we added a third value, well, then we would get a third column, and then the rows would of course change because we only have 5 elements. Right, and of course, we can also define the grid template rows. And so this will basically define the height of these rows. So let's say we want the first one to be 100 pixels and the second one 300 pixels high or tall. And so this is what we get. So we can completely customize basically how we want the elements to be laid out inside this two-dimensional grid. And this is really, really powerful and can be used in so many situations. Now, CSS Grid also introduced a very special unit, or a new unit, which is the FR unit. So instead of specifying some value here in pixels, we can write 1 FR. And so that will then occupy the remaining space. So if this one here was now only 20 pixels, then this one here would expand and occupy all the rest of the space that it can. And so this is an excellent way of specifying columns with the same width. So all of them 1FR, and so we have 3 equally sized columns. Or if we use 2FR, then the column in the middle will have double the size. So you see, and this is especially helpful because when we change the width of the page, then you see that everything adjusts, because then of course also this container gets bigger and then everything gets bigger. And if we specified these values in pixels, then that would not be happening. Okay. So these are the very fundamentals of grid. So let's just delete all of it. And the same for the HTML. Where is that? Ah, yeah, this was at the very top. So right here. Okay, so now we're back to what we had before. And now let's use CSS grid here for our layout as well. However, we will not really create a two-dimensional grid because this is just a very simple layout. So here we have no situation where we would actually need something that I just showed you with these 2 dimensions. What I will do is simply a grid with 2 columns, and in one column we will place this text here, and on the other side we will place this entire list here. So going back to the example, basically all of this main part here will become a grid container, and then the first grid item is this here, this list, and the second one is this other list. Now you might wonder why then we are not simply using Flexbox in order to do that, since Flexbox is perfect for a basically one-dimensional layout like that. And the reason is that whenever we need to specify the exact width of one of the columns, so of one of the elements, then sometimes it can actually be better to use CSS grid. So that's the reason why we're doing that. So again, we will do that here on the main. And so as always, I like to give it a class name so that all our big layout parts have a class name. That then looks a little bit nicer also in our CSS. So let's do that here at the top. So usually I like to keep all the layout parts here at the top. And actually let me show you something, because we can create something called comments in CSS. So comments is code that is only for us to read, but the browser will completely ignore it. So we write that with a /* to open the comment, and you see that immediately everything turned gray, basically. Then to close it, another star and another /, and we're back to normal. So let's just write layout here, or just layout. And this is not really a main layout. So let's just put it somewhere else here. Let's just say elements here. And so this is just to organize our code just a little bit. So let's come back here so we can actually see what we're doing. Okay, and so this main is what will become now our grid container. So remember, display grid, but that will not change anything. Also, I had a bug there, so a small mistake. But now let's actually do something with the grid. So let's create our columns. So grid, template, columns. And remember, we have 2 columns. The first one, I wanted to have a width of 250 pixels. And the second one should then simply occupy the rest of the space. And so that's where the 1FR comes into play again. So as I said before, whenever we need to display 2 elements side by side, and for one of them we really want to specify the width and want to make sure that it stays the same, then grid is a good tool to use. So let's give it a save, and there you go. So we have this on the one side and all of this, so this list, which in the future will grow a lot bigger. But for now we have it here on the left side. And for now, we cannot really see that we need a gap here, but later we will need a gap. So let's add it. Actually here, we can also see that because the dev tools, they actually have some really nice functionalities for Flexbox and Grid. So first of all, you can see immediately here that this is a Flex container because the dev tool really tells us that here. And then we can click here. And so then even when we move out, we can still see like the grid container itself and the grid items and also the gap. So everything is very nicely displayed here so that we can work with this tool. And the same is true for grid. And here we can see these, what they are called grid lines. So 1, 2, 3, and so on. But these are more advanced things that we will not talk about here. Again, you can take a look at my CSS course that I have just for this. Okay, but anyway, we see that we have no gap here at all. And so we can add that now. So let's add a big gap of 48 pixels. Okay, so here it is now. And that's actually it for CSS Grid. That's all we needed to create the layout that we want. So this one here. So the buttons, of course, need some more styling. They don't have any styles at all at this point, but we will keep that for a little bit later. So there are about 5 or 6 more lectures left in this section. And so we will use those to basically make this page look exactly the same as the one that we've been looking at. So hopefully this has been a lot of fun, and yeah, I hope you will keep having some more fun in the rest of the section. So let's go there right now.